Well, through most of our course on aging, we have concentrated on normal aging, the subject matter of gerontology. However, we have the grim task of finishing up our course by essentially by talking about dementia. Dementia is a terrible scourge. It's a terrible disease that's associated with late life. And it's aptly named. As you see on the slide in front of you, dementia is derived from the Latin for the taking of the mind. And that's exactly what these group of diseases do. The brain cells degenerate and die, and gradually the brain is destroyed, and with it, the mind. The person that we may have known all our life just dissolves in front of us as their essence is destroyed by this whole family of diseases. So since it's relatively common when we grow old to develop dementia, a course on aging would really be remiss if we did not tackle this grisly topic. So with that preamble out of the way, let's begin to take a look at what we mean by dementia. And then what we'll do later on is we'll focus on two different forms of dementia, namely Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. And then finally, we'll end the lecture series by looking at some of the research that's been done over the decades to try to discover what is the cause of Alzheimer's disease. And once a cause is identified, how might we as a society come up with interventions to either slow it down or to cure it. So let's begin by looking at what we mean by dementia. Dementia is a syndrome. That is, it refers to a group of related symptoms. And these groups of related symptoms can actually have any number of causes because there's more than one kind of dementia. And so when we talk about dementia, we're really talking about two groups of major symptoms. That is, we're talking about memory impairment and then various forms of cognitive impairment. And in order to make a diagnosis of dementia, we need to show that there is significant memory impairment and that there's one or more significant cognitive impairments. And not only that, those impairments have to be severe enough, significant enough to interfere with our ability to function socially or in our occupation. And I'll note that these dementias, diseases are often accompanied by depression, anxiety, and delirium. And by delirium, you see in the green note there, I mean some transient states that come and go where a person sort of just becomes totally confused and loses contact with the environment. Delirium is not necessary for any of these diseases. In fact, if the disease only presents itself in these temporary delirium states, usually you actually will rule dementia out as the diagnosis. Also, you see on the screen, I mentioned depression. This is a very important part of the diagnostic procedure because people in late life with very, very severe psychotic depressions can have symptoms that really mimic these same symptoms in dementia. And the clinician needs to make sure to rule out clinical depression as perhaps being the cause for the memory and cognitive symptoms that the patient is presenting with. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at different ways that we can test for these different types of impairments. We're going to focus mainly on the different forms of cognitive impairment. Before we do that, let's just take a simple look at how one would go about looking at memory impairment. And by deficits in memory impairment, what we typically are referring to in a dementia situation is recent memory. Memory for events that just occurred in the last couple of minutes, so to speak. And, you know, a real sort of real world common example that might be your aged mother calls you on the phone to give you some exciting family news. Only thing is that she just made the same call to you 5 minutes ago. And in that 5 minutes that elapsed, she totally forgot that she had called you to give you this news. And that's usually kind of a tell that there's some cognitive impairment beginning to develop there. One of the common ways that we test this in the clinic is we do a delayed 5-minute recall task. We'll see an example of that later on when we look at the MMSE, that is the mini mental state exam. That's sort of a ubiquitous, quick and dirty way of measuring and following cognitive decline that's associated with dementia. And we're really going to focus here on our description of a testing for dementia, or in the various forms of cognitive impairment. And what you see on the slide in front of you is 4 classes of cognitive impairment that are commonly examined in diagnoses of the various forms of dementia. And let's define them first. And then after we do that, let's take a closer look at the types of test instruments that clinicians can employ to begin to assess these different forms of cognitive impairment. So we begin with aphasia. And the aphasias refer to sort of language and speech problems. Language and speech is when it first begins to show up, it usually, problems show up, it usually represents a problem in the cortical areas of the brain that control those particular functions. The apraxias, on the other hand, involve difficulty executing skilled motor behaviors. And normally, those types of problems are down lower in the brain and involve sort of brainstem mechanisms. The agnosias involve problems with visual object recognition. They, in turn, involve still a different set of part of the brain, normally in the posterior pole of the brain, the occipital pole, and projections up into, if you will, the temporal and parietal lobes, where higher order visual function is mediated. And then finally, we see the executive functions that involve things like planning and organizing and sequencing activities. And impairments in these functions are usually related to brain deterioration, brain damage in the frontal lobes. So let's begin our exploration of the different techniques with aphasia, these impairments of language or speech. And they usually present themselves in dementia in the forms of difficulty finding the right word to use in a particular situation, which we refer to as anomia. And this, all of us sort of occasionally stumble to find the right word for, a particular object. But in anomia, this becomes very frequent, and it becomes commonly associated with words we use all the time instead of rare words. So, for example, you see on the slide in front of you, you can't recall the word watch, so you refer to it as a hand clock. Or grandfather is sitting at the Thanksgiving table, the vegetables are being passed around, and he points to, oh, could you pass me the bowl with the little green balls? He can't get the word P from his lexicon. And these are the types of symptoms we begin to see in people who are developing aphasias. A lot of pausing, a lot of groping for words, phrase repetitions, and these difficulties with language and symbolic representations in our brain also can translate into problems writing and also performing simple arithmetic calculations, since those two behaviors involve manipulation of abstract symbols. So some diagnostic tests that are typically used to identify that there is an aphasia, and then maybe be able to estimate how severe the aphasia is, are 2 tests I have on the screen in front of you right now, a word fluency test and the Boston naming test. So word fluency test is pretty straightforward, and might involve the example I have here is you are given a sheet of paper, or sometimes it can be words spoken out loud, but what you're given 2 minutes to identify as many exemplars of a given class or categories possible. The example I have here is name as many animals as you can in 2 minutes. So you might start out by saying cat, dog, bear, lion, giraffe, zebra, hippopotamus, and you start giving as many animals as you can think of, and then you begin to start to peter out eventually. And typically what we see is in a healthy older adult, you'll get 27 animals or exemplars, if you will, listed. That's the average for a healthy older adult. But in the case of a person with aphasia, in if you will, senile dementia of the Alzheimer's type here that I have listed, you would see only about 7 items. And that's quite a drastic reduction, and that's indicative of a problem with language generation. And if you will, it often would accompany a diagnosis of an aphasia. The Boston Naming Test is a standardized test with rigorous norms, and it involves if you will, a booklet that has 60 line drawings in it. And the person taking the test is given 20 seconds to look at each of the drawings, and they have to identify the drawing. So this is actually for people who are healthy. This is a very easy task to do. But for persons who have aphasia and might be in early stages of dementia, we can see they can have difficulty assigning names to relatively familiar objects. So you see, for example, on the slide in front of us, this acorn that we would typically label it is mislabeled as a coconut, an octopus as a spider. This actually rather difficult drawing of a harmonica is listed as a cash register. That's not terribly surprising that a person might make that mistake, but what about calling a pretzel a snake or a mushroom a lamp? They share some abstract characteristics, but there's this misclassification that's done, and this is showing a problem with basic, if you will, symbolic manipulation and, if you will, representation. It's a classic type of problem that's shown by a person with aphasia. Apraxia, on the other hand, is a problem with an actual motor behavior, a skilled motor behavior. And so what you have to do if you see a person that's having a problem with a skilled motor behavior is the first thing one has to do is rule out that the difficulty is due to something other than central nervous system involvement. Maybe the peripheral nervous system, maybe a pinched nerve in the neck, or maybe a person has a pretty severe arthritis, and that's preventing them from performing the motor skill. So once those obvious explanations are ruled out and it appears to be due to a problem in the brain, you can begin to do some testing to try to verify that that's the case. And typically what we see in apraxia is the real problem that's causing the motor behavior deficit is the ability of the brain to represent motor sequences. And we have some examples on the screen here of some problems that might present themselves in a person with apraxia. They might have problem buttoning their shirt, so to speak. And that's a skilled behavior they've been doing all of their lives, and they just can't quite seem to do it. It might take a real long time to button their shirt. And a way to really make this salient is to, when you ask somebody to button their shirt, you give them a quarter to hold in their hand at the same time. And adding that little extra complexity to the buttoning operation will really throw a person with apraxia for a loop. And similarly, you'll see problems using familiar utensils and tools. Difficulty, for example, taking a knife and fork and cutting a steak. Somebody might have been doing that for all their lives, and yet all of a sudden we see these difficulties with these relatively straightforward skilled motor behaviors. So a common clinical test for documenting apraxia is something as somewhat surprising as you think, as drawing a clock. You're given a piece of paper and say, draw a analog clock that is not a digital clock that says the numeral 7:22, but instead draw a digital clock with the numbers going around the circumference and a little hand and a big hand, so to speak. And if you look at the next slide, here's some examples of some big problems that get revealed in persons who have apraxia to various degrees. And you can see that these are really quite dramatic examples that are indicative of an underlying problem of doing these sort of representations in the, if you will, the motor system. Agnosias, on the other hand, involve the part of the brain that's involved with visual object recognition, namely the posterior parts of the brain in the cortices. And what we see typically is, despite the fact that people have good visual acuity, good color vision, etc., it's their ability to use that visual input to recognize objects that's impaired in agnosia. And patients, if you are careful with them and you're showing them objects they can't recognize, and you know, have them just describe the features, they can tell you that, oh, there's a round thing here, and there's two parallel lines, but they can't integrate them together to achieve the necessary object recognition. And so some diagnostic tests of this form of cognitive disorder, an agnosia, are there some picture sorting tests that require you to sort pictures into different categories, and in order to do that you have to recognize what the objects are in the picture. So that's a way of detecting and scoring a degree of agnosia. And there are other types of tests that have to do with incomplete pictures or occluded object test. In an incomplete picture test, you see an example on the slide in front of you now. I mean, you should be able to recognize this is a drawing. Somebody's beginning to draw a person, but they're missing one of their legs, they're missing one of their arms. Person with agnosia, that's just complete nonsense to them. They can't even begin to imagine what that figure might represent. And in occluded object task, what you do is you have multiple, if you will, objects in a picture. One picture is partially blocking the picture behind it. And what you typically see in that situation, when the picture is partially blocked, person with agnosia has no idea what the object being blocked might be. And finally, this fourth category of cognitive impairment that we can look at when we're trying to make a diagnosis of dementia is in higher order executive function. Executive functions, if you recall, are frontal lobe mediated functions that involve planning, organizing, sequencing activities. And to do these sequencing and organizing activities, you also need to keep goal states in mind and manage one or more goals. And there are several very, very well normed and commonly used procedures or tests, if you will, for revealing problems of executive function and for quantifying, if you will, the progression of diseases of executive function. And we're going to look at these tasks. One of the most common tests of executive function in a neuropsychological battery is what we call the trail making test. And the trail making test goes way back to Reitan's neuropsychological battery in the 1950s. And we're going to look at two versions of the trail making test, version A and version B. One is more difficult than the other, and the difficult version can be used for a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment and early forms of dementia. But that task becomes too difficult for people who are beginning to progress into dementia, and that's where the trail making A test comes in. It's a little easier and can then be used to follow the course of the disease during intermediate stages. And then we'll also see another test that's very commonly employed for the diagnosis of early cognitive impairment. and mild cognitive impairment in general, and that's the Wisconsin card sorting task. And with no further ado, let's look at the trail making task. And so here is an example of the trail making task. What you see here is a set of circles, and those circles, there's 20 of them, and those circles have the numbers 1 through 20 inclusive in them. And what your task is, if you think about this, kind of a visual search task. And what your task is to start out with, if you will, target number 1. I have that colored in yellow here. And you take a pencil and you start out with number 1 and you draw a line from number 1 to number 2, and then from 2 to 3, from 3 to 4, from 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, 9 to 10, etc., until you finally reach 20 up here. And you can see why it's called the trail making test. You're leaving a trail with your pencil. And one of the things you have to do is not only search through a complex array, but you have to keep in mind what the next goal is, what's the next number in the sequence. And then once you reach that goal, you have to update your goal. So maintaining a goal and updating the goal, these are important, if you will, executive functions that are mediated in the frontal lobe. And what we typically see on a task like this is that normal older adults can do the task in about 29 seconds. That's the average performance. And people, when they're given the instructions, is we want you to, they're given a practice test first with only maybe a quarter of the stimuli on it, so they make sure they understand what the task is. And then they're told, we want you to do this task as fast as you can, but we want you to maintain accuracy as well. And so what you typically will see in a dementia patient is they will take way longer to do this task. And you can see on average about 78 seconds to do it, almost 3 times longer. And also, not only will they take longer, but occasionally you'll see a lapse. They'll instead of going from 4 to 5, they might go from 4 to 6 or 4 to 7, something like that. So not only time, but the accuracy is usually a tell for a problem with executive function here. Healthy older people virtually never will show a lapse like that, that is skipping one of the numbers in the sequence. And like I said, the trail making test is relatively straightforward. All things being equal, it's a relatively simple task to do. And when people have essentially get into dementia, they can still do this task, but they may make some errors and slow down a bit. But in essentially very early dementia, when people are first beginning to have problems, this task might not be challenging enough. And what we see is a more challenging version of the trail making test, the trail making B. In the trail making B, you have to do the same thing. You have to keep a goal in mind. You have to update the goal as you go from item to item, in numerals 1, 2, 3. But intermixed with that is a second concomitant task. That is, you have to essentially trace the sequence through the alphabet, A, B, C, D, and you have to go back and forth between the two. So first of all, it's pretty hard to even describe that task to someone. You have to give them some practice on it, several trials so they truly understand it. And trying to describe this task to someone who's, in moderate dementia, you're not going to get them to do this task. This is for diagnosis of people in the earlier stages. And so you need to connect the dots, but you need to go from 1 to A, and then from A to 2, and then from 2 to B, and from B to 3. So what you're doing is you're constantly going back and forth between those, if you will, 2 different tasks, the numerical sequence task and the alphabetic task. And this is quite challenging. So on the screen in front of us, we'd start out with the number 1. And then from number 1, what we'd have to do, we have to find A. And once we have A, then we have to go back to numbers, to number 2. And then we have to keep, what was the last letter? Oh, well, now we have to go to B. And now from B, we have to go to 3. And from 3, we have to switch the letters to C. Oh, and from C, we have to switch back to numbers to 4, and then back to letters, D, et cetera, and back to 5. So this is quite a challenging task, and it's usually, like I said, useful in the early stages of the diagnosis of a dementia disorder. Normal older adults do this task in about 95 seconds, and compare that to trail making, only 29 seconds on trail making, 95 seconds for normal older adults on trail making B. But look at dementia patients. It's like, you know, astronomical increase in the time that it takes to complete the task. And we often see many, many lapses and errors, like failing to switch from numbers to letters or vice versa, or skipping a few items in the sequence, so to speak. Very, very useful and widely used diagnostic task for, if you will, identifying and quantifying diseases of executive function. And then we have the Wisconsin card sorting test, which again is sensitive for early detection of mild cognitive impairment. And this task is based on a classic abstract concept formation, if you will, task. And it's a little hard to describe, and that's why I'm going to show you a video demonstration of the task. But what you do in the Wisconsin card sorting task is, what you need to do is you're shown cards that have different shapes on them. It could be triangles, could be circles, could be squares, so to speak, or stars, or the stimuli could also vary in their color: red, green, blue, yellow, that sort of thing. And not only that, the stimuli could vary in their numerosity. There could be one stimulus on a card, or 2, or 3, or 4. So what you have to do now is you have to, as you're shown each card, what you need to do is you need to categorize it, and categorize it according to a rule. The only problem is you don't know what the rule is. You got to figure it out. And the only way you can do that is by getting feedback through trial and error. So let's suppose you're shown a card that has 2 blue stars on it. And you say, oh, the rule is that the color of the stimuli are blue. And you get negative feedback. So, now maybe the rule is that there's 2 items, or maybe it's the color is blue. So now you get another card on it, and it has 3 items on it, and they're a different shape, and they're also blue. Also, let's say they're red, and you say, I think the rule is that there's X, this particular dimension, and you keep guessing back and forth until you start getting a few in a row correct, and now you feel as though you have identified the rule. And then what happens is, once you've identified the rule and have done it for a few times, what happens in the task is they change the rule. And now all of a sudden, if you use the old rule, you start getting negative feedback. You start being told that your choice is wrong. Now you got to rediscover a new rule, so to speak. So what the task is sensitive to is your ability to maintain all this hypothesis testing capability, to shuffle your hypotheses, to in your working memory keep track of the evidence that you've been accumulating based on your correct, incorrect responses. All in all, this is seen as a big load on your working memory and the management of that working memory using your frontal lobe executive processes. So again, this is hard to describe in a few words, and the best way to get a feel for how the Wisconsin card sorting task works is to actually see it in operation. So what I've done is I've gone out to the website and I've recorded a little session of myself interacting with this website that implements an online version of the Wisconsin card sorting task. And bear with me for a bit and watch how I handle this task, and see if you can get the idea of what the underlying sort of dynamics of the Wisconsin card sorting task is all about. Okay, we're starting the Wisconsin card sorting task, and it's going to give us some instructions. And here we need to match a card to one of the 4 tasks presented at the top of the screen. So we'll click on one of the 4 cards that match the card on the left. Following my selection, I'll get some feedback of whether the match was correct or incorrect. What I'm really searching for here is a rule that connects the test card to the 4 cards that are shown on the top of the screen. So I'll hit the space bar to see the rest of the instructions here. And the match could be of the test card here to the 4 samples could be based on the number of objects on the card or the shape or the color. So, all right, so you see here you have color, number, or shape. And once we figured out what the rule is to use, it'll ultimately change the rule on us, and then we'll have to discover a new rule. So let's quit the instructions and start. Okay, so I have 2 gold stars. I'm gonna guess it's gold. Okay, so that was correct. I have red here, so I'm gonna guess it's red.
No.
Okay, so it must be star. It must be shape, so diamond, diamond. So I got that correct. So green star, there's a star. Okay, so it seems to be shape. Star again. That's good. Okay, circle, I'll select circle. So it looks like shape is the rule here. And it'll keep going that way until it changes the rule on me. So, okay, so diamond. So the rule is still diamond. Circle. Rule still circle, it's still shape. Okay.
No.
Okay, so now it just changed the rule. So now I got to find a new rule. Okay, is it green?
No.
Okay, so it's not green. So maybe it's numerosity 3. Okay, so there's 3. Okay, so 4. 4. So far it's looking like the numerosity rule. Correct. That's correct. I'm going. Okay, 3 items. So and 2 items. There. Okay, and then 4 items. And 2 items. So it should be changing the rule anytime now. Okay, so 4 items. Okay, so now what could it be? Could it be color? Let's try color. Okay, so match color, color. Okay, we're matching color again. All right, so at this point, you should catch the drift of the Wisconsin card sorting task. All right, so we've taken a look at several different ways of measuring and revealing problems with aphasias and apraxia, agnosias, and finally with executive function. Perhaps the most commonly used tool is a test called the mini mental state exam that it was put out in the public domain by the Merck pharmaceutical company in their famous Merck Manual of Geriatrics that provides us with, if you will, an assessment of all of those different types of cognitive capabilities in a quick and easy to present format. And I would say that by and large, the MMSE or the mini mental state exam is the most commonly used instrument for monitoring cognitive function in dementia patients. As I mentioned already, it's simple to use and it's a free instrument. People like free instead of having to pay for psychological tests. And most psychological tests that are well normed, et cetera, you don't use for free. You have to pay for each administration of the test packet, but that's not the case for the MMSE. So let's see how this instrument captures the various criteria that we need to use to make a dementia diagnosis. And when we look at the exam, one of the things it should also reveal to you is just how profound the effects of dementia are, because this is really a very, very easy test. And if people perform poorly on this test, it's just indicative of just how far gone their cognitive capabilities really are. And it's quite sobering to consider what dementia can reduce individuals to. So let's take a look at the mini mental state exam. This is on the screen. What you literally have is a copy of the test in front of you as the administrator would see it. And as we go through this test, what you should be able to observe, I have on the slide in front of us, is that this test captures the patient's ability to orient themselves in time and place. It is a quick and dirty test of their attention capability. It's a quick test of their recent memory. It's a test of their working memory, their ability to manipulate the contents of their memory. And it also is a test of aphasia and apraxia, all built into this very, very quick and simple assessment tool. So let's begin by looking at each of the elements in the test. So the first element, two elements in the test are questions that have to do with orientation for time and orientation for place. You know, when is it versus where are you, so to speak. And there's a total of 30 points you can earn in this test, and fully 10 of them are earned up here on orientation. So how do you earn the 5 points for the orientation? You have to know what year it is. In the case of this filming of this lecture, it's 2020. What season is it? It's spring. What's the date? Oh, well, the date is the 15th. Interestingly, that's tax day because it's also the month of April, and the day of the week, it's Wednesday. So if you get all those correct, you get 5 points. You have good orientation for time. As your dementia proceeds, your orientation becomes less and less reliable, and you begin to lose points on this, but only as the progression gets pretty bad. We also can earn 5 points for orientation of place. So what state are we in? We're in South Dakota. What county? Clay County. Town of Vermilion. What facility and floor? That's usually referring to a hospital complex, but in my case, the facility is the South Dakota Union Building on the USD campus, and the floor is, I'm way up high, I'm on the 3rd floor. So I would earn all 5 points. So far, I'm doing pretty well. Okay, what about registration? This has to do with, this is an attention task in many ways, but also it loads onto sort of, if you will, aphasia. So what you do for the person is you name 3 objects, and you make sure the person can repeat the objects back to you. And you do it several times to make as many as it takes for the person to be able to remember to name the 3 objects back to you. So I'll say ball, hammer, and chair. And then I ask the person to repeat those back to me. If they had mild cognitive impairment, probably the first time they'll say ball, hammer, and chair. Maybe you have to repeat them to them again before they can repeat them back. And you keep track of the number of trials and the number of times you have to repeat the 3 words before they get repeated back to you, because that could be sensitive to, if you will, progress of the disease. And if you get all 3 items, you earn 3 points. If you can only give me back 2, you get 2 points. Only 1, you get 1 point. And now we proceed to the second phase of the test, if you will. And this is really, it's labeled attention and calculation, but I would say what this really is loading onto is essentially our working memory and a little bit of executive function, because what you're asked to do here is the serial sevens task. You need to count backwards from 100 by sevens. And so if you get all 5 of those counts correct, you get 5 points. If you only get to 1, you get 1 point, etc. And alternatively, if you have a person who's got a problem with numbers for various reasons, you can ask them to spell the word world, W-O-R-L-D, ask them to spell that backwards. And so they'd say D-L-R-O-W, and then they get all 5 points, so to speak. So you can see, remember in our memory lectures in this class, When you ask people to begin to manipulate the contents of their short-term memory, that's where you begin to see a little bit of problem even in normal older adults. And people with dementia, this is very, very difficult and very diagnostic. And then we see you can earn 3 points next on this task in terms of recall. And the recall would be, you know, I asked you earlier to name those 3 objects. What were those 3 objects I asked you to name? And can you tell me what those 3 objects were? Wall, hammer, and chair, I think. You get the 3 points here, so to speak. So now we get back into language and aphasia and those types of things, and we ask someone to give me a brand name for a type of pen, and also give me a brand name for a type of wristwatch. Well, you'd be surprised how many people say Rolex and Bic, probably because of universal advertising, so to speak. I mean, how many people do you think own a Rolex? Not very many. But it's surprising how many times people say Rolex. That's sort of a demonstration of the power of modern marketing. But you pick up a point for the capability of people to go into their lexicon and be able to make a match between a category and a name. And that's where you can pick up a couple of points there in the aphasia category. Then you're asked to repeat a difficult phrase, and that phrase is no ifs, ands, or buts. And if you can repeat that, no ifs, ands, or buts, then you get a point. And again, that's kind of sensitive to people's linguistic skills. Then you're asked to essentially do a procedural task. And this procedural task is you take a blank piece of paper, you have a blank piece of paper on the ready someplace in your testing procedure. So here in my office, I have a blank piece of paper here, and you hand it to somebody and you say, okay, I want you to take this paper, and you usually hand it to them in their non-dominant hand, and I want you to fold it in half and place it on the floor. And that person then proceeds to follow your instructions. They fold it in half, and then they lay it on the floor. Then they pick up the appropriate number of points based on how well they could follow those instructions. And this captures a very important mental capacity. Then essentially you show them another piece of paper, and on that piece of paper it has the command, close your eyes. And so you say, okay, I want you to follow the command on this sheet of paper. You show them the sheet of paper, and if they close their eyes, then they're capable of doing that. Then you ask them to write a complete sentence, and you score it based on whether it has the structure of a complete sentence. Again, this is capturing aphasia, and you need to have what? A subject, an object, and a verb to have a complete sentence. And then finally on this task, we have if you will, a test that captures apraxia, the ability to essentially make a complex representation in our motor system and then execute it. And that's a case where what you need to do is copy this design here. You have to draw a pentagon and then a second pentagon that overlaps with it in the correct order. And as people's dementia begins to, if you will, advance, they have very, very great difficulties doing this task. In many ways, it's kind of similar to that clock drawing task that we saw earlier, and we saw it as a way of measuring, if you will, apraxia. And it's, again, part of this mini mental state exam. So you can see how it's capturing orientation for time and place, certain basic attention capabilities, recent memory, if you will, working memory, and if you will, executive function to a particular degree, aphasia and apraxia, all in a quick and dirty tool. And what we typically find with this test is that about 95% of the community population of older folks score 24 and above. Okay, so that's sort of our baseline. If you begin to see scores below 24, that's when you begin to see some cognitive impairment. People who score 21 to 24 are said to have mild cognitive impairment. If they score between 10 and 20 points, they have moderate cognitive impairment, and they're pretty impaired if they can only get a 20, a 10, between a 10 and 20 on this test. And if they're severely impaired, they're lucky if they can get, somewhere close to 9 points. And this is, again, scores on this test can be taken over time. And if you imagine plotting the score on the test over time, you can kind of look at the progression of the disorder as it advances over time. So what we're going to do next, now that we have sort of covered dementia, if you will, writ large as a syndrome, as a group of many disorders, what we're going to do in the next lecture is we're going to look at the various flavors of dementia, and we're going to focus on two types: Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. And the reason we're going to focus on those two types is that together they account for about 80% of the people who've been diagnosed with dementia. There are many other forms of dementia that make up the residual beyond that 80%. But by focusing on those two, we can be looking at the lion's share of individuals who are diagnosed with, if you will, one of the dementias. And then finally, in our third lecture on this series, what we'll look at is we'll look at the attempts of scientists to understand what causes Alzheimer's disease and how those ideas have evolved, and what types of recent efforts and clinical trials have been done to try to develop interventions. And maybe even we can peek a little bit into the future and see what might be happening 10 years down the road in that third and final lecture in this sequence.